Welcome, everyone, to today's In Dialogue on Byzantine Icons. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Clare Elliott. I'm the Associate Research Curator for the Menil collection. And although my training is not in Byzantine art, in the last 10 years or so working with this collection, I've become quite familiar with it. The Menil's celebrated collection of Byzantine icons is widely regarded as one of the most important in the United States. With approximately 60 objects dating from the 6th to the 18th centuries, it encompasses a number of distinct cultures, including Greek, Balkan, and Russian. The breadth and quality of the collection are emblematic of the ambitions and the values, both aesthetic and spiritual, that guided Dominique and John de Menil throughout their lives as collectors. Icons are quite different from Western painting, even Western religious paintings. Orthodox believers understand them not merely as religious images, but as sacred images that go beyond depicting holy figures and events. In today's talk, I will briefly discuss how this extraordinary collection came to be at the Menil, and including the role of Dr. Richard Temple in that. And using examples from our collection, Richard will explore the ways that Orthodox religious beliefs are embodied in these images. I'm thrilled to introduce you today to Dr. Richard Temple, a specialist in icons and sacred art who is joining us from London. Thanks to our new virtual reality, we can have guests like Dick Temple here with us, even while he remains apart. Dr. Richard Temple has more than 50 years of experience in the study, restoration, and exhibition of ancient icons and sacred art. He founded the Temple Gallery in 1959 in London, which he still runs, and that's where he comes from today. You can see him with some of his treasures. Temple completed his PhD at the University of Wales for his thesis, The Esoteric Tradition and Peter Bruegel the Elder. His fascination with icons is not, however, academic. It stems from his intensive study of ancient sacred traditions, including Neoplatonism, Christian Hesychasm, and the emergence of Christianity from Hellenistic culture. He is the author of Icons, Divine Beauty, Icons and the Mystical Origins of Christianity, and Masterpieces of Early Christian Art and Icons, among many other publications. Welcome, Richard.
Thank you, Claire. I would like to thank you and the Menil collection for the great honor and pleasure of being with you, and especially because some of the icons we're going to look at played a very great role in my life in the 1970s and 1980s when they were in the Temple Gallery and subsequently in the Bradley collection that I helped to form and curated before they went to you in Houston. So,
quickly before we begin, can I remind our participants, our audience, to submit any questions throughout the program? You can email those to programs@menil.org. That's menil.org, and we'll maybe take some as they come in, and we'll leave a little time at the end to answer them as well. So we could have the first slide. I'm going to give a very short version of how these icons came to be in Houston. Richard gave us a little bit of a preview. They came from Eric Bradley's collection. But before that, if I can see the next slide, Dominique de Menil in particular, this was kind of her corner of the of a collection. She had purchased in the 60s and the 70s over 1,000 of these small everyday objects from the 3rd to 11th centuries that were part of kind of a Byzantine everyday way of life. She was attracted to this kind of material partly out of family pride. Her great uncle, Gustave Schlumberger, had been an early Byzantine archaeologist, and she herself considered herself a frustrated archaeologist. So she had this interesting, kind of quirky collection of objects. And then the next slide, she and John had also purchased this really extraordinary Byzantine reliquary, a very small but very powerful work, less than 2 inches tall. And perhaps they bought this partly because of it seems to correspond aesthetically with the kind of minimal art they were looking at that point in their collecting. But it remains, it's on view now, and it often is, one of the most compelling works in our entire collection. And in 1980, when she began to think about a museum for her private collection, she sought the advice of Bertrand Davjac, Byzantinist, and asked him to kind of survey her holdings. And he saw these materials and he said, you know, what you're missing are some really great icons. So he set about to advise her on finding icons to fill out her collection. And this is the first icon that they acquired together for the Menil Foundation. It's a large Russian anastasis. Of course, Byzantine culture was not bound by the Byzantine borders of the Byzantine Empire, either geographically or temporally, especially in Russia, which was not part of the Byzantine Empire. They adopted quite a few aspects of the Byzantine culture, and most importantly, its tradition of icon paintings, adopted and made completely their own in some ways as well. So it would have gone on in this manner, buying one or two icons of good quality as they became available, and as funds allowed. If it weren't for a compelling event in 1983, if I could see the next slide, the foundation was approached by given a very suspicious offer, really. They were shown a group of Byzantine fresco mosaics that had been cut into small fragments, and it was obvious that there was something fishy about this purchase. Many things made it suspicious, and they did a little research, and it was not hard to discover these were in fact stolen from a church in Cyprus, and to purchase any of them or all of them would have not been an ethical thing to do, but also they weren't comfortable to just abandon this group of works to the black market, where they would have disappeared into less scrupulous collectors' hands. So they organized a landmark agreement with the Church of Cyprus that they would pay off the dealers. I use that word in quotes, these, disreputable dealers, and they would pay importantly, for the lengthy restoration of these objects. And in exchange, they were allowed to remain on loan to the Menil Foundation for 15 years. They created this purpose-built building designed by Francois de Menil that evokes the original context of the the frescoes, and they were on view on the Menil campus, the Byzantine Fresco Chapel Museum, from 1997 to 2012. The following year, the next slide, another amazing Byzantine opportunity was presented to them. The collection of Eric Bradley, which, as Dick has told us, was co-curated by Eric and by Dick Temple, and was a collection unparalleled by any other private collector of icons, Byzantine, post-Byzantine, and Russian from the 6th to the 17th centuries. Temple had built a special gallery in his basement, which is what we're looking at here. Dominique went with her advisors to look at this collection, thinking that she would buy 5 or 6 of her favorite ones for her museum that she was about to open. But when she saw the collection, and when she saw Eric's devotion and his passion for these objects, she had to rescue the whole thing, just like she had the frescoes, and she bought the entire collection. So that is the collection that we are discussing today, or objects from that collection, and Dick will share with him that passion that animated it. And with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire. So, in this first section of the icons I'm going to talk about, I have put in the title the word presence. And if we look at the next slide, please, the little icon of the 13th century of Saint Marina, one of the most extraordinary surviving objects from Byzantine antiquity anywhere in the world, an extraordinarily important and rare, and I think you would agree, beautiful object. Saint Marina. The overwhelming impression from me, looking at it just as a picture, as an object, is this sense of the presence. The way the artist creates this inner verticality, the way our attention is taken towards her look. We can see that in the next slide, please. She is absolutely there, absolutely present. It's a very mysterious word, present. We know what it means, and yet it's difficult to define. And in the context of the sacred tradition of icon painting, we can discover a very deep and important meaning. Let's look at the next image, please. I've put next to it a detail of an icon with the face of Christ. It's not as old as the Saint Marina. This one is, I've called it late medieval. We don't know exactly the period. But it has similar colors and a similar kind of quality of compelling our attention through the presence expressed in the look, in the power of the look, particularly the expression of the eyes. You don't see it very clearly, but in the halo around the head are letters. And to understand better, I'm going to go to another slide, the next slide. This is not in the Menil collection, this is in a private collection in Belgium, but it's an icon of Christ, an absolutely classic image of the Byzantine tradition of Christ, half-length, with this overpowering sense of presence in the way that it fills the space, relates to the universality of eternity of the gold ground behind, and the penetrating look. And if we look at the next slide, please, we see much more clearly the letters in the halo, written in Greek, Omega, Omicron, Nu. They stand for Ho-On. Ho-On is, if you know ancient Greek and read the Bible in Greek, Ho-On is the way God identifies himself to Moses when Moses is on Mount Sinai in his dialogue with God. I am that I am, if you know the King James version of the Bible. Ho-On, being, the one who is, I am. So this is the sense of presence which all icons aspire to, and which the great works of art, such as we are looking at, are able to express. So let's look at the next slide, just to remind us how, in fact, it's universal, this look. And at this period, in the medieval period, when icon painting was very closely associated with the practice of contemplative prayer in the monasteries, we'll talk about that in a minute, you see this look. And if we look at the next slide, the close-up of Saint Marina, one feels her life, her attention, the fact that she knows something, that she could communicate deep wisdom to us. So let's look at the next slide. This is the lower part of the icon showing her gesture. And this is part of what this striving for presence in the chaos of life, striving for being, how it's achieved. If you put your heart on your left hand on your heart, and hold your right hand up with the palm outwards, hold it, there, stop. You are expressing the inner life, presence, and the materiality of the outer life. And if you put a cross, as she has, this is the source of light which fills the entire icon and relates to this expression of presence through defining the inner life and the outer world. We look at the next one, please. And here we jump from the 13th century to the Greco-Roman world in Egypt in the 2nd century. This is a funeral shroud. It's in the Benakis Museum in Athens, and we find an extraordinarily similar image. We need to remind ourselves that the origins of Christianity, we think they come from Jerusalem and Rome, which they do, but we forget that Egypt, with its extraordinary uh, access to ancient wisdom and ancient knowledge, was in the Roman world the source of great respect. All the great ancient philosophers in Alexandria admired the wisdom of Egypt, and the first Christian monasteries were reacting in a world, or Greco-Roman Egyptian world. So this figure makes the same gesture with her right hand. In her left hand, she holds the ankh, in ancient Egypt, the symbol of life. In fact, if you go deeply into Egyptian ancient wisdom, it's the symbol of eternal life. In other words, what the funeral portrait is about. Um, we're going to develop this idea a bit later, but let's go now to another icon. The next slide, please. Another one of the extraordinary Byzantine objects in the Menil collection, the little icon of Saint Stephen. So we are familiar now with this quality of presence and how it's expressed in his look, in his bearing, in his physical presence. And if we look at the close-up, the next slide, we
So
enter,
beautiful.
we enter so intimately and personally into this. You're right. It's beautiful. It's extraordinarily beautiful, and this beauty is, we can say, spiritual beauty, the inner life of the saint, um, who is part of that tradition. We look at the next slide, and it's side by side with an icon of St. Demetrius of exactly the same date. Both these icons are attributed by the historians to the around 1300, the year 1300. And the St. Demetrius, like the St. Stephen, uh, he's a warrior, but he doesn't look very fierce here. He has this same quality of inner beauty, of contemplative inner concentration, and at the same time touchingly human and tender, almost vulnerable, you could say. And both these icons, and especially this one on the right, has been related to this tradition of Egyptian funeral portrait painting. If we look at the next slide, this is an image from the 2nd century of one of the portraits attached to the sarcophagus of the deceased. And we have to understand that this is a funeral portrait, and yet it's celebrating life. Very astonishing in Roman Egypt in the 2nd century how naturalistic they could achieve by different techniques, of course, but
It's
Here
definitely
it is.
not the stereotype of Egyptian art that we're
No,
used to. This is definitely a different.
it's not. It comes, you're quite right, and thank you for pointing that out, Claire. It comes from the presence in Egypt in the second century of Greek and Roman intellectuals and artists. Everybody who was an educated person in the Roman world uh, recognized Egypt as the source of wisdom and knowledge, philosophical knowledge, religious knowledge, spiritual knowledge. Um, so here is this look, which is a portrait of a deceased person, and yet it's extraordinarily lifelike. So it's a celebration of death, it's a celebration of life, and we can tell by his look, it's a celebration of life beyond death, a celebration of the person, the individual in eternity. And
And would
this
these
one,
have been a little bit idealized portraits, or were they, or do we know?
well, we don't know a lot.
Yeah.
There's been a great deal of study in, I would say, my lifetime, the last 50 years or so. They were mainly discovered in the late 19th century by archaeologists. And there are examples of them. This one is in the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, in most of the great museums of the
We
world.
also have one or two examples of these
Ah,
here at the
that's
Menil. Yeah.
very good. I haven't seen those. And they, in my opinion, are the key to the one of the mysterious qualities in all early Byzantine icons and throughout the entire tradition of icon painting, this quality of presence, presence in eternity, our life in eternity. Um, let's look at the next one, which is the St. Stephen and this unknown young man side by side, because I don't think anyone could disagree that we are essentially looking at the same quality, this quality of the mystery of eternal life. Um, we'll look briefly at another slide, the next slide, please, just to show what was going on in the world at that time. The figure on the left is a portrait of Christ from the 5th century. Figure of Christ, painting of Christ of the 5th century. It's in the Coptic Museum in Cairo. And on the right is a painting in the Getty Foundation of the god Serapis. And once
Mm.
again, we are, especially in the look, how the eyes are painted in this world of, as somebody has described it, the gaze on eternity, eternal life, but the living presence of the individual, eternally living. Um, so let's look at the next slide to take us close in to St. Stephen, which in the end of the 12th century, around 1300, is the recipient of this age-old, hundreds, thousands of years old tradition of art expressing the greatest of all great philosophical and religious truths, eternal life. Not as an abstract concept, but as a living person, an individual person. So we can pause a minute. Let's look at the next slide. Um, I'm going to speak now about another group of icons. This is slightly later. That we've been talking about the 1200s. Um, Constantinople was lost in a catastrophic event in 1204 when the Western the Normans under Count Baldwin, backed by the Venetian businessmen, sacked Constantinople. They were crusaders on their way to Jerusalem. They were fed up, they were tired, they were hungry. They got as far as Constantinople and they thought, why should we bother with Jerusalem? Here's a beautiful city with great treasures, great luxuries, beautiful women,
Splendor.
everything we want.
Yes.
So they plundered their brother
Hmm.
Christians. It was a disgraceful event.
Mm.
Um, the city eventually came back to the Byzantines in 1276, but the great power of the great political and military power of Constantinople was over. They'd lost all the lands of what is now Turkey and quite a lot of the Balkans. But there was a final 150 years or so of spiritual, the flame of the intellectual and the artistic and the spiritual life flared for the last time with more brilliance than ever. So if we look at the next slide, um, this is one of your icons. Yes,
Yes.
this is the St. Nicholas
As
in
the
the
other two
Menil
that we've been
collection.
talking about, Marina and Stephen, those are also
Indeed, of
ours.
course.
And those ones are actually also on view. This one is not on view currently.
Um, it's an extraordinarily beautiful and powerful icon, but it's in a different style from the Middle Byzantine period icons. This is the 14th century. Just for a moment, because I think it will amuse everybody. We don't have to be serious all the time. Let's look at the next slide, because when I originally bought that icon, before it went into the Bradley collection and then eventually to you in Houston, it had a cover on it from Russia, made in Russia, by a very famous silversmith and enamelist called Pavel Ovchinnikov, around 1900 probably. And that was the fashion in imperial and aristocratic circles in Russia to turn their icons into what we would call today luxury goods. They put these very elaborate, expensive, rich looking jeweled and enameled silver or silver gilt covers, which is very, very strange because it um, doesn't, although it looks expensive and it's what Russian oligarchs today love to collect, but we're a long way from the mysticism and the spirituality
Yes.
of the 1200s or the 1300s.
A little bit
Uh,
distracting from that
a little bit
gaze that
distracting. And in fact, I took that cover off
yes.
and the icon passed on to its new owners without it. Um, but it's interesting to show it as part of the history of the object. Because
Definitely. Yeah.
we're talking about objects that have lives much
Yes,
longer than
hundreds
us,
of years of
hundreds and
yeah.
hundreds. So let's look at a close up of St. Nicholas, the
Yeah.
next slide, please. And if we go in closely, you see that it's still the inner life, but he has a more far away expression, a more melancholy expression in a way. One theory is that this is in the last period before what everybody knew had to happen, that Constantinople would fall. Constantinople was the greatest city in the world. No other city of the Middle Ages, Bruges, Venice, London, any of the great medieval mercantile cities were provincial outposts compared with Constantinople, which was in fact the second Rome. Rome fell and Constantinople became the new Rome or the second Rome, and what we call Byzantium was actually the Roman Empire in the east. And all the great knowledge and power of Rome was continuous. The light of learning never was dimmed in Constantinople. There was never what we call a dark ages. Religion thrived side by side with philosophy so that they knew Plato and Aristotle and all the great wisdom of Greek philosophy. Anyway, this was unthinkable, but it was going to happen. Constantinople, after 1,000 years or so, would soon end. And maybe this look of sorrow is expressed in this. I don't want to look at me. I want to look at St. Nicholas. Um, maybe this face expresses that. Now, if we look at the next slide, uh, we have an image of somebody very, very important in the history of spirituality, not only in Byzantium, but in the world, throughout the world. This is a man called Saint Gregory Palamas, who lived in the 14th century. It's a fragment of fresco painting in the monastery of Batupedi on Mount Athos. And we see that he has something of the same look. and a look which we are familiar with. It's extraordinarily beautiful, and at the same time, on the human plane, we can relate very intimately. And he has this faraway look, this look of melancholy, but it's more associated with what he was personally responsible for throughout the whole of Byzantium was the revival of a special contemplative practice called Hesychasm. Hesychia is the Greek word for silence and stillness. And he revived what had always been there from the 4th century, from the origins of Christianity, in the life of monks, in the monastic life. There's a in the writing of Saint Paul, he says, "Pray without ceasing." And the monastic tradition of Byzantium put that literally into practice, and they developed techniques with the breath, with the rhythm of the heartbeat, to repeat the famous prayer, the Jesus prayer, with the rhythm of the breath, uh, with continuous, unceasing intensity. They even trained themselves to pray while they slept.
Oh
So this
wow! And with
produced,
and they would use the icons in the course of this kind of
yes,
yeah,
if you were, an icon could be
kind
used
of
like a Tibetan tanka to focus
yes,
the
kind of like a
concentration.
yeah to focus on yeah.
And the I, it was a very powerful movement within this politically collapsing era, and it was central to what was essentially transferred to Russia. And it's why Russian icons, as we'll see in a moment, are so important because the Byzantines in the 14th century developed ways of expressing the energies evolved in this prayer practice, which nowadays one would be more familiar if you went to a Zen monastery in Japan or the Vipassana schools in South Asia. And indeed, some of the Sufi schools in the Middle East had similar practices of intense interior focusing of the mind within the body through the breath, maybe through the rhythm of the heartbeat, to keep the mind concentrated on God. And this is what I think our St. Nicholas expresses. Um, and if we look now at another icon, one of the most extraordinary icons from the Byzantine world, which you've got, the next slide, please. This is a close-up of St. Nicholas. Yes, now. No, let's go to the next one.
The next one,
Um, that's right. This
John
is
the Baptist,
St. John the Baptist.
not on view, but will be on view this fall, the end of
Well,
September. He's gonna make
I,
his next
I think
appearance in the gallery.
I think he should always be on view.
Yeah, probably.
This is one of the most important icons in the world because of what it expresses. If we look at the uh, yes, I'm going to tell you something interesting now. Look at the next slide, please, and we'll see that is an icon almost identical, painted by a Russian painter, and it's in one of the cathedrals in the Kremlin museum. Well, the Kremlin, one of the churches in the Kremlin, the Church of the Annunciation. Um, and this is painted in 1580, so nearly 200 years after the St.
Later.
John, and yet, if we look at the next slide, we'll see how close they
How close
are.
they are.
They're extraordinarily identical. So this was a tradition not only of art, but of this monastic practice of intense um, contemplative prayer or meditation, hesychasm, for which certain icons beautifully express it. We notice several interesting things um, in the St. John icon. Um, we can go back to next slide, please. We'll look at the St. John icon.
The St. John.
He
You have to
put,
say this is a difficult icon to photograph because of all that gold, and it's as impressive as it is in this photograph, it is in person
It's true, it's too dark.
really, really
Yes,
extraordinary. Yeah.
it's too dark. But that will encourage anybody in or near Houston to go and
Yes, hopefully.
digitally look,
Yes,
and
I
you
hope so.
see with this extraordinary experience. But St. John, again, the gesture is very helpful to us. He has a staff with a cross on top of it, but his hand is raised in such a way that his finger points upwards. His other hand is a very extraordinary gesture because it's held towards his chest. We saw that in the St. Marina icon,
Yeah.
and we saw it in the Egyptian shroud painting. So there is no doubt in my mind that St. John is expressing mystical truths about presence, about the living presence of life in eternity. And I don't think other Byzantinists have pointed this out because it's much more to do with the not what art historians uh, are primarily concerned with, but and in fact, many Orthodox theologians might raise an eyebrow as to what I'm saying, because what I'm really talking about is elements of universal truth found in all traditions of religious art when it's connected with mystical practice. But let's look at the next slide now, please. This may surprise you. Here is Leonardo's painting in the Louvre of St. John the Baptist. And of course, this is a Renaissance portrait, extraordinarily powerful as an image. It's dark, and we don't see the staff with the cross which he holds in his left hand, but we see very clearly his right hand, rather, his left hand pointing upwards. Now, the Renaissance inherited from Greek philosophy the principles of Neoplatonism, which had imbued a great deal of Christianity, of course. Most of the great theologians of the 4th and 5th century were educated men of the Roman Empire whose outlook on life was a Greek philosophical outlook, a Neoplatonist look. And Neoplatonists see God as the one. And this gesture of pointing upwards is the acknowledgement of the absolute, or the Father, or the One. And it's not surprising to me that our St. John also has this pointed finger.
Pointed up.
And also, Leonardo hides this. The other hand of St. John
It's doing this.
is on his chest, pointing towards himself.
Yeah.
So it's the I am, the presence. Um, Let us pass on to another image, just very briefly. This is Raphael's famous painting, any student of the Renaissance will know, in the Vatican, where Plato is pointing upwards, signifying the one of Italian humanism and the Neoplatonism, which is common to both Christianity and to Renaissance. So let's look again at the next slide. And here they are together.
Together.
And most Byzantinists would be maybe a little surprised. Many Greek Orthodox would be surprised. But I think there is a common link at the spiritual level between these two paintings. So we pause a minute. Let's look at the next slide. I see that it's no, we have time, I think.
We have time.
Yes.
Yeah.
So here is this blazing look that we are familiar with now in all the icons from the Menil collection we've seen. This inner life expressed with such energy. And we understand it. It's not painted in anything like we are familiar with Western art, because it's non-realistic, and yet the painter is clearly a master painter, But he is not concerned with chiaroscuro
Hmm.
or light and shade modeling or perspective. He is concerned in expressing the eternal truth of accessible to those who practice mystical prayer, hesychast prayer.
Hesychasm.
And he was probably a hesychast practitioner himself.
Yeah. And the
I
painters would have that same spiritual background that
probably
I mean, they
yes,
were all part of the same, they were
yes.
all part of the monastery, which was part of
Icon
the,
painting was and is today. There could be icon painting schools in some of the
mhm,
monasteries. Not all the monasteries were hesychast schools, and not all
right.
the monasteries were schools of painting. But sometimes it all comes together, and where it does, you get these
Hmm.
unbelievable
Really extraordinary.
masterpieces of art, masterpieces of the visual expression of truth of the great mystery of life and death,
Yeah.
and our eternal life. Um,
We have a
so,
question quickly from one of our
yes,
viewers.
I'm very interested. Yes.
You see it? Is there, can you talk about the symbolic meaning of the
Ah,
materials, like
now,
the gold?
yes.
This is a good one to
I
talk
can.
about that.
I can. Yes. Um, Unlike Western art, we don't have perspective because the figure of St. John is presented to us as a figure existing in eternity. In other words, where he lives, it's not the three-dimensional world that we are living in, but the multi-dimensional world, where there is no space as we understand it, or time as we understand it. Time and space are attributes of the physical world, the terrestrial world. But these are the world of the absolute, of heaven, of eternity, concepts which we give words to, but words alone will not render their meaning. We can only understand them when we are able to find those moments which we all know deeply within ourselves when another truth is divulged to us. And this is the importance of icons, especially icons of this caliber, because as we said before, they are a focus for our attention when we are trying to, as Marina so beautifully shows us, hold off the material world and pay attention to our spiritual world. So, um, uh, actually, we can go back a minute because now that you've asked this question, I have a theory
Yeah.
that um, the practitioners of spiritual practice, whether it's the Sufi zikr or the Zen meditation or the Hesychast spiritual contemplation of the monks, that certain energies are transformed within the being who practices intense meditation. And this transformation of energy has its counterpart in art. That is to say, the painter uses his materials, which are pigments, which come out of the earth, mineral pigments, and he puts them through a process of transformation, which is so extraordinary that when you, as you can, stand in front of the picture, quieten yourself for the moment so that you allow the pulsing energies of the picture to come into your own presence, you have an impression that the material has undergone a transformation. The techniques, the physical techniques of of painting, and this is not unique to icon painting, of course. It's true of the great masters, Leonardo da Vinci, Titian, Peter Bruegel, who I studied, all achieved this transformation of matter, which in itself is a symbol of transformation of spiritual energies, to create this living presence. So I hope that answers Joe
Answers.
O'Hare's
Yeah.
question a bit, but it's a
And
huge subject.
on a
Um,
non-function, a non-symbolic level, the gold, if you think about space lit by oil lamp or candle, is going to create a very otherworldly kind of dynamic effect. So there's
Absolutely right.
that part of
Absolutely
it
right.
as well.
In fact, all icons should be seen only lit by oil lamps and by candlelight, where the movement of the flame glimmers and glitters on the gold, so that you have this almost magic effect
Yeah.
of, you know, that the Byzantine tradition is an assault to attend a full Byzantine Orthodox liturgy. It's an assault on all of the
All your
senses,
senses. Yeah.
including smell,
Incense,
taste,
music.
music, the visual impressions.
Hmm.
Um, uh, I would love to talk more about this, but I feel time is going to get the better of us.
Yes.
Let's move on.
Yes.
So, we talked for a second about Russia because when Constantinople fell finally in 1453, it was the end of the world. I mean, it's as if you woke up one morning and found on the media that New York had gone. Something unimaginable. And it happened because Byzantium was not only a great empire, but it was the repository of all the great knowledge of religion, of Christianity. Even medieval Europe deferred to Constantinople, and all of early medieval European painting comes from what was going on in Constantinople. We completely forget what Constantinople meant for the world, whether you were China or Russia or Europe or the Balkans or North Africa, much of which North Africa, of course, was Byzantine, part of the Byzantine Empire. So, the most for the point of view of what we're talking about, the great spiritual truths, the monasteries of Byzantium and of Mount Athos um, were guardians of the great mystical secrets, esoteric secrets, if you like, which you could only approach through a long initiation and a long, uh, intense devotion to practice. Um, so the Holy Synod in Russia convened in order to declare themselves the Third Rome. The significance of this, Constantinople was the Second Rome, or the New Rome, and when it fell, Russia, Moscow declared itself the Third Rome, primarily to guarantee the mystical continuity of the great truths, the spiritual truths. There's nothing to do so much with politics. There were, of course, because religion is always gets mixed up with politics. But the kind of religion we're talking about is that aspect of religion which is nothing to do with politics, even almost nothing to do with the world as we know it, but the higher world. And so we will look now at the next slide, please, one of your most extraordinary icons. This is an icon from the famous Novgorod.
God, school.
In the Middle Ages, Novgorod was, after Kiev, the most important city in Russia. Moscow hadn't really appeared yet as a great center. Um, uh, but Russia had been Christianized by the great Vladimir the Great in 988. He was the great Slav prince in Kiev, nowadays Ukraine. And for political reasons, he was trying to make alliances with the Byzantine emperor. And in fact, he got a Byzantine princess as a wife. That had never happened in the whole history of the world to a non Christian. And in fact, part of the deal was that he became Christian himself and then took all the citizens of Kiev down to the river Dnieper to be baptized. So Byzantine Christianity was, plus the culture that comes with it, was then introduced to Russia in the 10th century and was spreading throughout the 11th and the 12th century throughout Russia, as far north as Novgorod, which was the great, powerful city, magnificent place. And that was the beginning of the grandeur of Russia. Russia was not a united country. That didn't come till much later. That was under Moscow. It was divided up into a number of different principalities. And after the fall of Constantinople, many Byzantine intellectuals and theologians and artists. There were two universities, two monasteries in Russia that we would think of today as universities, with each one with 1,000 Greek monks, scholars, theologians, and artists. So an incredible transfer of the great secrets, the spiritual traditions of Byzantium were transferred to Russia, and it's one of the reasons why Russian icons, especially in this medieval period, are so extraordinary. So, if we look at the close-up of this icon of the raising of Lazarus, here is Lazarus. Novgorod is famous for its rich and brilliant, strong colors, and that is most clear in the figure of Lazarus, looking rather delighted to have been raised.
Very alive.
Dead. Very alive, in fact. But so the Novgorodians, well, they got it from Byzantium, of course, but this is something to do with their understanding of light, because the way the icons are depicted, which are not literal, not naturalistic, they are symbolic. It's why you can't have the naturalism of Western art, because it's the idea, the symbolic idea, which is being communicated. And here, light is the idea. Light is, of course, the symbol par excellence of spirituality. And I'm going to show you now, next slide, please. This is a mosaic apse in a Byzantine church of the 13th century, tragically destroyed in the 1920s, just outside Smyrna, the ancient Byzantine city, today Izmir. But this tells us more than books and explanations can about how the Byzantine artists understood light. So there is the Mother of God with the Christ child standing in the apse. Above her is heaven, represented by a circle, and from which are great flashes of light, illuminating the whole world, and signifying the importance of the Mother of God and Christ now on earth as human beings. Although the Greek inscription around the circle at the top tells us, thou hast created him outside time, or before time, as somebody has translated it here. So we are not looking at a historical event. We're looking at events outside time and space. And light, the appearance of light, which of course is a physical event as well as a spiritual one. We can go back now to looking at our icon. Christ surrounded with the apostles. And it's very interesting how the painter has put all the accents of the light onto Lazarus and not Christ. Christ is visually, artistically, a secondary feature in this. We look at another detail here because the next slide, some extraordinary event is happening, and we see from the expressions of the faces that a great mystery is happening. it's, I mean, even if it was a purely physical event of a poor dead person being suddenly told to stand up and walking and talking again, but we're talking about a much, much more interesting idea of um, new life, as the icons we saw before are celebrating. So the whole icon now, next slide, please. Um, it's the mystery here that the artist has very beautifully expressed, because the light comes from Lazarus. It fills the entire picture. You can see it bouncing off the edges of the rocks and giving color to the medieval mind. The component elements of light are color. So color in icons is never naturalistic. Color is simply light, expressed in terms of color. The source of light is apparently Lazarus. In fact, the source of light is Christ,
Jesus Christ.
but it's understated. So it is very mysterious and beautiful how the understated figure of Christ, with his gesture, creates this tremendous drama of light bringing life, spiritual life, a mystical event, eternal life, which then flows into the whole world. Um, it's this really introduces us to how a Byzantine painter could think, how an artist could think. It's abstract, and it's no surprise that when the icons were rediscovered in Russia in the 1890s and the early 1900s, that was the birth of abstract painting in Russia. The first Russian avant-garde painters, the constructivists, were painting under the inspiration of what the medieval Russian icon painters had discovered, how to create abstract images, abstracted from reality, to express ideas. Um, let's come to the next slide now, which is, I think, one of the most
Athanasius.
beautiful icons in the world.
We may have
Again,
to, close, wrap up our
we
remarks
are
on
wrapping
this.
up. We are
Yeah,
wrapping
good.
up. Don't
Cool.
worry, Claire.
No, no
So,
worries.
if we go to the close-up, the next slide, please, and even the next one, this icon really expresses in the expression and the rhythm everything we've been talked about.
Yes.
From his look, it is an entirely interior experience.
Yeah. His body
It,
is almost kind of dematerialized entirely.
exactly, you
Yeah.
used just the correct word. We dematerialize the physical world in order to celebrate the spiritual life.
And you can see also, this is the one I always use as the example when we're talking about Russian modernists. If we look at the kind of patterning,
Yes.
how abstracted it gets
Yeah.
on his robe, you can easily make that connection to someone like Malevich or Larionov or any of those Russian modern masters.
Exactly.
And this icon also, along with the St. John's, will go on view. I mentioned in the fall, and that's one of our questions. It's the easiest one, so I'm going to answer it. We're going to install those the last week of September. So provided that nothing interrupts that schedule, which for the last year has not been the case, but looks like things are settling down, hopefully. That should be happening in October, and we'll certainly uh, makes social media or some sort of post about that when it happens. We have other questions. Dr. Temple, would you say something about the later artistic fusion that combined styles from Italian Renaissance art and Byzantine art? There was an
Ah,
exhibition in New York that talked about how this developed in Crete.
yes, indeed. Uh, I'll try and be brief, because we're talking about a major cultural trend between Byzantium and Europe. But the great masters of Constantinople in those final years were not getting commissions, because it was the end and there was no money. Um, so the island of Crete had when the Crusaders took Constantinople, had passed from Byzantine control to the Venetian Empire, and it became Venetian. So many of the leading artists started going to Crete, where they could practice their religion, where the economy was thriving, and not far away was the patronage of some of the greatest art patrons in the world, the great Venetian merchants and aristocrats. Some of those Cretan painters even went to Venice, and when Crete itself, much later in the 17th century, fell to the Turks, the Cretan school was centered in Venice. If you go to Venice, there's a church called San Giorgio dei Greci, with a Hellenic institute and a beautiful collection of icons. So Europe had always admired Byzantium, and European religious had always admired icons, and especially traditional people for their religious pictures didn't want this modern Titian painting. They wanted good old-fashioned wooden panels with gold ground. And the Cretans, it was the first major international art world where Cretans on the island of Crete, or some of them in Venice, had workshops employing up to 30 or 40 assistants, painting religious pictures, icons, for their Venetian patrons. There's even a document, an art dealer from 1490 in Crete, with a contract for 700 icons from 2 different master painters'
Oh, wow.
workshops. And the end of the term was 7 months. So you can imagine it was an industry.
Yeah.
And Cretan icons were hugely in demand and famous throughout not only Venice, but Italy, and throughout Europe, in fact. I was summoned not very long ago to Windsor Castle, where the chapel there has a
Very
Cretan
much
icon.
in the news these days.
Yes, where the chapel there has a Cretan icon of St. George
Oh, wow.
and the dragon. So Cretan icons we can find in Europe. It's very close to me because we discovered an important icon by the most famous of all the Byzantine Cretan masters, called Angelos. But that's another story. So that's very briefly the
Yeah.
outline of Crete.
Yeah, and there was trade too between
Between
Constantinople and Venice and Western Europe. So there was wasn't as divided as maybe it is in like my art history books, for example.
Yes, that's quite right. That's quite
Yeah.
right.
There was another question that I liked. Was realistic portraiture and drawing common outside of funerary purposes in second century Egypt? Do you happen to know? I wouldn't be able to
Very,
answer
very,
that.
very interesting question, because it depends. Realism and reality are interesting words.
Yeah, it's an interesting
With
concept.
profound philosophical,
Mm-hmm.
because in our particularly Western way of thinking, with our scientific minds, we think reality is what you can see and touch and measure. In fact, according to official science, anything you can't see and touch and measure doesn't exist,
Mm-hmm.
Which is why science has to be atheistic.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it's why the universe has no God. It's godless. It's just dead. It's tragic that people have to think like that, but there it is. So, to the philosophers and the theologians and the artists, because I put artists into the same category as prophets who have ecstatic visions of
Mm-hmm.
the divine world. And artists see things which we can't see. They feel
Yeah.
things that we can't see. They even know things that we can't see. And it's their job to communicate to us what they have experienced. ecstatic visions of what they would call higher reality, the
Exactly.
reality of the multidimensional
Surreality.
world. Exactly. And so they developed a language from the early Christian times, as we've seen, largely through Egypt. The visual language is through Egypt because of that extraordinary language of Egyptian art and the hieroglyphs, which are symbolic and ritualized images. But it also happened that some of the greatest Greek philosophers and artists were also in Egypt. Anybody who was intellectually and artistically adventurous was Egypt.
Is in Egypt.
So you have the tradition of the Fayum portraits making its way into the early icons. This is really another lecture. If we look at the great Christ on Mount Sinai, for example, and the pre iconoclast period icons, you can see this development. But the icons gradually become less realistic and more emblematic,
Mhm.
or but even the very earliest icons of the 6th century and the 7th century, then everything has to stop through the iconoclast controversy of the 8th century, and it starts again in the 9th century where they left off before iconoclasm. And then the St. Marina and the St. Stephen that we saw still have elements of the naturalism of the Ayub portraits. And it's
Mhm.
really the great 14th century, the Paleologan revival, which develops this more stylized manner, which is the great Paleologan school, which is the last great phase of Byzantine art.
Of Byzantine art.
It's so difficult to encapsulate these just in
Big ideas. Yeah, I
uh,
mean, your point is interesting though, because when you see these Fayum portraits, they're always so sensual and these big almond eyes and
yes, yes,
perfect curls hair. So
yes.
unless everyone who died in Egypt was amazing looking, perhaps they're not that
Well,
realistic.
according to
Uh,
one school of thought, you
More
had
like
your
idealized. But I know what the question was. I understand the
some
question.
people think that you had your funeral portrait painted when you were in the prime of life,
That makes sense. They seem to
and that you lived with it
usually.
as a reminder of your death,
Ah,
because
yes, yeah, okay.
contemplation of death is a spiritual practice.
Yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yes.
I know a monk who has had his coffin built and he sleeps next to it.
Oh, wow.
Same
That's
thing. Um,
that's heavy.
so, um, so thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
We've been on quite an adventure. I feel it.
Yeah, definitely. I really enjoyed. I always like listening to you talk about these works because the love is so evident and infectious. So I'll thank you very much for making time, giving up your dinner hour to be with us today. Also, thanks to Lauren Pollock and Anthony Martinez in our programming department, and for Cesar for all his tech help. I would like to
You
remind
can mention
our
my grandson Aaron, who did the tech help on
thank
this
you,
one.
Aaron, for helping out on that end. Um, And I'll remind our viewers that the Menil collection is open for visitors. Our mask mandate is still in effect, and we are at limited capacity. You can get a timed entry ticket for free at menil.org. If you want to make a spontaneous trip, I don't want to discourage that. We are almost never at capacity, and we can let you in. You can buy copies of Imprinting the Divine, Byzantine and Russian icons at the Menil Collection at our bookstore or on their website. And finally, Wednesday, March 24th, I think that is in 2 weeks, author and University of Houston art history professor Natalie Herron will be joined by the Menil Drawing Institute's assistant curator Kelly Montana, for a discussion of Fluxus events and an expanded field of instructional drawing from the 1950s and 60s. Natalie knows all kinds of interesting things about Fluxus, so I would encourage you all to check that out if you are available. And that's it. Thank you so much, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you.